I'm back.
Cool. We're all back. We have a few minutes, maybe about 15 or 20 minutes, I think, to take questions from the audience for Quế Mai and Phong. And just now we are off the air. This is not going to be broadcast anywhere. You can say whatever you want. There's no censorship taking place right now.
Cheers.
So yes, cheers. You can drink, you can smoke, do whatever you need to do. That is reasonably legal, of course.
And thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us for so long. We still have more than 121 people who have stayed over an hour listening to us. You guys are amazing. I love you so much. Thank you.
You can see here why Quế Mai can do a 60-stop book tour.
Yeah,
on the energy level.
Quế Mai can do an entire Prairie by Night show with no breaks.
Okay, so this is my first time looking at the questions in the Q&A. Did we pick anything to start off with?
We haven't. While we do that, though, I mean, and Phong and Quế Mai, do y'all want to? Yeah. You haven't had a chance to talk to each other yet, you know.
I've already told Quế Mai how much I love Dust Child and Mountain Sing, of course. I wanted to also add how surreal it was to be reading a book with a character. One of the focal characters has my name, exact Phong Nguyen, right? So that was like I'm used to seeing Vietnamese movies and then in the credits seeing my name appear like 17 times. But I'm not used to reading like literature and having a character with my name. So it was a very resonant emotional experience, even though of course the character is very unlike me, but still, you know, being half Vietnamese, half American, as well as my name. So yeah.
All right. So on that topic, Greg Barbie's question is, I think there's a couple questions like this, but how tough was it to write Dust Child and include a main character as a white American helicopter pilot veteran? That's for Quế Mai, but in general, I think the question is asking, what is it like to write about characters who are not like you exactly in a biographical sense? So obviously, Quế Mai wrote about a veteran, a white American veteran, but also Quế Mai is not mixed race, and she wrote about mixed race people. And in Phong's case, you're not a woman. You wrote about women, and as we talked about earlier in the show, you were also writing about white people yourself in the your take on the Mark Twain stories. So that's the question. Like, what are the challenges in writing about characters who are not exactly like you? Let's start off with Phong.
Well, I will say for the like drafting process, like I advise other writers, and I take this to heart myself, and not writing defensively, not imagining various constituencies and audiences, like what is my mother going to think as she reads this, and what is this person going to think as they read this. But then when you decide to put it out there and publish, that's when you sort of reckon with these bigger questions about, you know, what you're doing and what you're putting out there. And so for me, it all, you know, unfolded as I was going through revising and thinking about, you know, how it would be received. And so one of the experiences I had, I think this is sort of next door to your question, but was my dad really took issue with the fact that in the beheading of Lord Chung and Tisak, that the Chung sisters were there in that scene, whereas in the canonical Vietnamese version of the story, they were not present for that. But it was narratively necessary for my book to have them be there. But there was a kind of an attack upon the Chung sisters themselves, and I really had to kind of tone that down, thinking, considering audiences that might be, who revere the Chung sisters and see them as these flawless figures, not having this assault upon them be so severe. And so I still, kept them in that scene because everything that happens after it echoes back to that moment. And yet it was very important to honor, the opinions of, in this case, my father, but, a reader who had a stake in the story and where it was going. And similarly, when it came to representing aspects of their character that had specifically to do with their sex and gender, such as their traveling amongst the people and in the mountains, I had to be very attentive to how that was represented, and the fact that it could very easily be construed as a man clumsily bumbling through a representation of female characters. So it's about research, and it's about interrogation of one's own process.
As for me, thank you so much, Anh Phong. I want to say that how much I love the bronze drum, and I admire, Anh Phong work very much. So I encourage all of you to read this novel. So for me, each writing project, I set it as a challenge for me to grow and to learn. And I think writing about other people's experiences requires me to do a lot more research, more learning, to understand their emotions, their inner, world. But also, to decolonize literature about Vietnam, normally as Vietnamese writers, we are expected, and especially as writers of color or minority writers, we are expected to write what we know. And I want to prove that we are artists who have the ability to imagine, to empathize, to create a new world. We are not just bridges or vessels into our own experiences, but we can create, a world of imagination as well. And American writers have given the rights to write in the viewpoints of Vietnamese women all the time, right? There's also a white writer who has won big prizes writing in the voices of women, of Vietnamese women. And so I thought, why don't I write, in the viewpoint of an American man, a white man, helicopter pilot, no less. So I had fun learning about helicopters, about their experiences. And I also, I also want to write about racist attitude, or, men's perspective on women, using the men's perspective. And I must tell you that I have fun writing against the colonists. For example, in my book, a Vietnamese man, Thien, he says this about the French who once occupied Vietnam. When France invaded Vietnam, we took the bread and made it better. Mm-hmm. I really think that, bánh mì Vietnamese sandwich is better than French sandwich. Should I apologize to French readers?
That goes without saying. I dare anybody, even the French, to disagree with that statement. Vietnamese bánh mì is better than any kind of, French sandwich that I've had.
Yeah, but I had fun writing things like that. And I think, but I wouldn't have been able to write this book without the support of so many people who are like my first readers, who are, because, I have sensitive readers who have the real life experiences. And I'm really extra careful because, I did not live their experiences. So I want to be, really careful. And so, for example, when I write in the voices of the American helicopter pilot, I have my wonderful friend Wen Kalin, who attended it today as well, who read for me and who advised me about things I could have improved. And I also have Bob Mason, who's a former helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and who wrote wonderful memoirs, including Chicken Hawk, which I highly recommend. So he, generously read the manuscript and helped me, with a few technical things that make it true and authentic, because there are so many particular things that happened during the war, during that intense time. And if you were not there, it's hard to imagine. So this book is the result of the help from so many people. So I sincerely thank them.
Thanks, Chị Quế Mai and then Phong. For both of your books, for the folks, like if we wanted to, for example, share with our parents, right? Will both of them be translated into Vietnamese? Like, can we find Vietnamese copies? Maybe Phong, maybe you want to start?
Sure. So there was an inquiry about having it translated into Vietnamese. I passed that along to my literary agent. I don't know what's happening with that, but it's more important to me that it reaches Vietnamese American readers than that it reaches Vietnamese readers, because Vietnamese readers already know the story of the Trung sisters, and they know it well, and it's not as it doesn't fill as great of a need, I think, for Vietnamese readers as it does for Vietnamese American readers.
And then Chị Quế Mai, as also a follow-up question to include in whether Dust Child will be translated into Vietnamese. What was it like for you to write in English, and how did you overcome those challenges? Is a question that we're getting from some folks in the Q&A.
Oh, I mean, sometimes I do crazy things, you know. I mean, that's why I said without Anh Viet, I wouldn't be here, because when I wrote The Mountain Sing, I had to use the dictionary, you know. I studied English in the 8th grade, so I grew up in the rural area of Vietnam. I did not have an English teacher until when I was in the 8th grade. There was a teacher who came to my hometown to volunteer. So he gave free English classes, you know, to poor kids. So I learned through him, and you know, so writing The Mountain Sing and Dust Child was really difficult, but I learned a lot, and you know, so, and you know, I enjoyed the challenge, and I think writing in English gave me a certain kind of freedom. I mean, to be honest, this is you know, there's censorship in Vietnam, you know, so whenever even I publish a poem in Vietnamese, it would be censored. So for example, I wrote a poem about our island dispute, and I used the word enemy because our boatmen were being attacked at sea. So I said the enemy, you know, like overturn our boats. And the editor of the newspaper said we can't call the other country the enemy, we have to call them strangers. They changed the enemy to strangers. So there is censorship in poetry, in anything you write in Vietnam. So I wanted to have that freedom to express my thoughts, you know, and to have that space to create. So so it has been challenging, but also has been a lot of fun. And I think writing in English makes it possible for my work to have a broader access, you know, to now the book is being translated to so many languages, and you know, and I feel like the need to insert a voice from Vietnam into the canon of literature about Vietnam in English.
On the Chinese issue, we have a question from Cecile Jung for Phong. It's about the Hai Ba Jung sister of the the Jung sisters, Hai Ba Jung. She asks, does the bronze drum have any content that may be considered anti-Chinese that might cause, well, it's a personal question for her, cause me trouble if I take the book with me to Vietnam? But you know, more broadly, you know, what would be the connotations of that given the geopolitics that are happening today?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think the short answer is yes. I mean that it would be it could be construed in that way. It was very deliberate to include a more nuanced portrait of Ma Yuan, partly because he's the one who's left a historical record, and partly because he's a fascinating historical figure. You know, he had a really strong sense of duty, and duty to family, and duty to country, duty to the emperor, and he really you know, thrived on problem solving and challenges, and was really looking forward to confronting and facing the Trung sisters in the field of combat, and was kind of disappointed when her allies left her, or their allies left them, you know, high and dry, and it was more of a massacre, right? So while the governor is pretty wicked and unrelentingly wicked, and some of the officers also, it could be seen that is you know, as being against the Chinese in that way, because the Chinese were their enemy. I was careful to include a representation of one of these enemies, at least, who was subtler and more nuanced. And so whether that nuance is going to be recognized by the authorities in Vietnam, I don't know. You know.
will be interesting to see whether the Chinese would translate the novel in either in Taiwan or in Republic of China. We have a question from Zui Lei, that I think is pertinent for both of you, and I'm particularly interested because we have Quế Mai here with her Vietnamese language expertise. But he asks us a question that always comes up for those of us who are the Vietnamese outside of Vietnam, which is basically from his account, traveling as a Vietnamese person overseas, always sees Vietnamese artists dealing with the subject of the war. And of course, he says he understands why Vietnamese people are still trying to process the complex culture and identity issues as we went through so many wars being colonized. But he wonders whether we as storytellers focus too much on the war, the Vietnam War, and so that the impression of our Vietnamese identity is just war and war stories. Is it possible if we could just move to the future a little bit more and share more stories about other rich aspects of Vietnamese culture, not just the war? So I just want to preface it by saying, obviously, Phong, you're an American and you've written about a bunch of other things that are not dealing with the war. It's really, and that, but with the Bronze Drum, it's not about the Vietnam War, it's about Vietnamese history. So there's that context. And Quế Mai, you, I think out of all four of us, you can actually read Vietnamese and you're fully fluent in Vietnamese. You obviously know very well the situation of Vietnamese language, literature, and so on. And it's interesting that, in writing in English, you in the two novels, Dust Child and The Mountain Sing, you've chosen to write about the period of the American War, the French War and the American War. So what are your two takes on Yulei's question about why can't we move on beyond war stories?
I can say for me that was very much in the forefront of my thinking as I wrote Bronze Drum, and was one of the motivations for writing it, is to write a story about Vietnam, set in Vietnam, that wasn't about Vietnam War. It is about war, but I was also very careful to make sure that that the majority of the book is actually not set in the midst of the war. So, and that's been to the dismay of some readers who thought, well, we're going to get war from cover to cover. But the first half of the book, or a little more than the first half of the book, is about these sisters and their relationships and their struggles and their oppression at the hands of the Han, and dealing with the consequences of their actions. And so it's about relationships, and then we get into the war in the deeper into the second half of the book. So I was very conscious of that, and in some ways the book is a reaction to that. So I'm really grateful for the question.
Quế Mai, you're muted.
Because I muted because there were airplanes flying. I really appreciate Anh Phong's notes there. For me, even though my book deals with the war, but I present Vietnam as a country full of history, culture, complexity in our human relationships. And I also want to write about the impact of the war, because there's such a strong need for healing and reconciliation. I mean, our parents' generations are still very traumatized by the war, and also I think I have met older Vietnamese Americans who have refused to go back to Vietnam, saying that they have lost the country, and some of them also don't want their kids to go back. So I feel the need to reach out to them, to have that conversation, to say we're all humans, and if they come back to Vietnam, maybe it would help them to heal as well. And I feel like there is still so much to be done for our own Vietnamese community. So in a way, I have centered the Vietnamese stories in my book with the hope that we discuss with each other more and help each other heal. And with my third novel, I'm moving on from the war. Actually, I think I have written 50,000 words on my third novel on human trafficking. This is completely, removed from the war, and it's about the present day Vietnam, not just Vietnam as a culture, Vietnam as a country, but the failure of our health system to take care of the poor, and also the risk of many women from rural areas to be trafficked. Do you know that Vietnam is one of the the source countries for human trafficking and human smuggling, and the stories are just so heartbreaking.
Yes. Well, let's end with a couple of more lighthearted questions, or, okay. So, I mean, Philip, you had something, right? That you were.
I got one. So
Okay.
one of the questions, maybe kind of, oh man, this is not really lighthearted, but
It means we don't know how to be lighthearted unless
we don't. And
no,
yeah, it's all tragedy and pain and trauma and things like that. A lot of the time. There's a question about social injustices. Tuk Nguyen asked if y'all's parents talked to you about these isms, right? While you were growing up. I want to kind of spin that question and ask, like, if there's a way that y'all talk about I think that all of y'all are parents, right? How do you talk about these isms, particularly as they relate to Viet people, right, to your children as they grow up? Well, I'll pass it to Anh Viet first.
Well, I think you just be honest about it, because there's a lot of it in American society. And I've always tried to be forthright with my children, not with my 3-year-old so much, but my 9-year-old, talked a lot about various kinds of things that he might encounter. And by 9 years old, American children are seeing racism and sexism and homophobia in the elementary school classroom. And he's been good about coming home and asking me questions about that when he hears epithets, for example. Or when he hears about, colonialism and racism and things like that. So he actually surprises me by, when he hears a comment from somebody who says, that's kind of racist. I'm like, you're right. That is kind of racist. So I think it's up to us to understand that, we do want to protect our kids, but they're also being exposed to all kinds of things out of our control. And we really need to be able to prepare them for that before they encounter them. Or go ahead, go ahead. Okay.
Oh yeah, or phone. Yeah, either.
I mean, I completely agree with Anh Viet about being, honest with the kids and talking about these issues, because my kids come home from school, or they read a book, or they have a friend who encountered these things, and we talk about it very frankly. And I think I can learn a lot from conversations with my kids who are like teenagers at the moment. And there is so much social injustices at the moment, and I also want to inspire my kids to do something, to take action rather than just to think. So at the moment I'm based in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and my son is visiting us, and I'm arranging for him to volunteer at orphanages, to go and help out with food distribution to the homeless. And then our kids would then understand what it means to be privileged, and with a small action you can do so much to help by being there, distributing food. You're not just helping people, but you sharing loves and care for them, and that's very huge, important, the human connections.
Yeah, in terms of the first question about how did my parents wrestle with these issues and deal with these questions, my dad was not a very talkative person growing up. I mean, he would tell stories sometimes, but he didn't really impart any kind of strategies for dealing with these isms, as the questioners put them, and I thought, well, I'm going to do something very different from my father with my kids. I'm going to just talk to them about these things. But I found that it is different the way that I deal with these issues with my kids. But I also suffer from this what's called like false consensus fallacy, where like if somebody says something ignorant, like in my presence in front of my kids, my first thought isn't like, oh, shut that down. My first thought is like, well, that's obviously stupid. Like nobody's going to think that serious, And so that's that false consensus. Like everybody agrees that that's an ignorant thing. So let's move on. And so, but you can't rely on that as an educator. You can't rely on that as a parent. And so I've had to kind of retrain myself to sort of call out those moments of ignorant speech, because it's not my nature to do so. My nature is to say, let's smooth it over and move on to the next thing. But yeah, it's been more of a struggle, but I found myself doing that more often, for my kids. My kids are now, 2 out of 3 of them are out of the house and grown up, and so yeah, so maybe I'll do better with the third.
Famous
Also,
last
Phong,
words.
yeah. Also, Phong, that's a really nice, like your background has been just like catching my eye, you know, I'm sure
Yeah,
folks
yeah.
like, would you mind?
Yeah, I'll talk
Is there
about
a
this.
story behind it?
Yeah, well, this is I'm in my dining room, and this is a painting by my wife Sarah Nguyen, who is an artist, and she does cut paper work as well as painting, and she exhibits all over the country, sometimes internationally, and yeah, so you can find her work at Sarah Nguyen Artist.
Nice. And then I think we also dropped you Nguyễn Phan Quế Mai's link to her website where you can find all of the dates of the, I think, 60 shows where she'll be in the US in the
basically
coming
60
months.
stops. You would have to work hard not to be within the vicinity of one of these bookstores. I mean, one of these tour stops. It's amazing. I'm impressed.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yes.
Okay,
bigger.
two last questions before. Wait a minute, it's getting late. As I'm really, you know, we're so grateful that 93 of you have stuck with us to the Q&A with our artists. Philip has one last question, and then I have one last really incredibly difficult question for our guests.
Being Vietnamese is hard, period. We talk about so many things, trauma, tragedy, et cetera, et cetera. How do you balance all of that in your personal lives, navigating your personal lives in your writing? How do you hold space for the possibility for Vietnamese joy?
Thanks to Brittany Fount for asking that question.
Yes, thank you, Brittany. We'll start with you, G. Quế Mai.
I think I celebrate being Vietnamese. I love being Vietnamese despite all the challenges, despite the difficulties, despite the expectations. One of the books that helps me a lot with handling with pressure at the moment is Happiness by Master Thich Nhat Hanh. And Master Thich Nhat Hanh wrote this at the beginning of the book. We are so busy that sometimes we forget who we are or what we are doing. Some of us even forget how to breathe. So, you know, if you feel pressure, just take deep breath, because like with deep breathing, we calm down, and, you know, like the more busy, more demanding the world around us is, the more calm we need to be. And I think Master Thich Nhat Hanh, his books are life-changing for me. It's about being present, being, you know, like grounded in yourself and not worrying about the world. And, you know, I highly recommend his books. And and I celebrate being Vietnamese and being around you, around all of you who champion other Vietnamese are just incredible. And before I'm, you know, like I want to say that please take this opportunity to be here to support Divan, because I need to say that Divan is publishing a lot of amazing Vietnamese voices. Watermark, which is an anthology of Vietnamese American voices. Nothing Follows, incredible poetry by Lan Duong. It's like a celebration of the Vietnamese spirit and survival. Hanoi at Midnight, which is like translated short story collections from Bảo Ninh, who wrote one of the best books about Vietnam, The Sorrow of War. And this anthology is like you know, collection of his best stories, and he's a master short story writer. So support our publications, and if you have the opportunity, please donate to Divan, because we uplift the Vietnamese voices. And we have, you know, a publishing series that translates and publish a lot of amazing titles. Even you donate 50 cents or $1, it will help us a great deal. So thank you.
So I've had to reckon with this question in a deep way with my current project, because it's the first book that I'm writing inspired by personal history and family history, and so there's the pain and the joy, right? And then I think the way that I'm thinking about it and the way that I am integrating it is that the pain is inevitable, right? And so what the question is, what do you do with it? And if you're making art from it, you're making, you know, it inspires you to make life more precious by making art and music and literature and to create, then that pain is not wasted, it's not lost, it has meaning, right? And so rather than say the way to experience the joy is to push away the pain, it's to instead to transmute that pain into something that brings others joy. And
that's very Thich Nhat Hanh of you, by the way. And in fact, I have a little box set of 5 very thin Thich Nhat Hanh books that I got from my son, who's 9 years old. And every night we read like 2 pages, it's like 100 words from Thich Nhat Hanh. And, you know, because it's my attempt to like prevent him from becoming a Catholic. It's like, oh, you know, but instead we can actually learn something else.
There you go.
So
I used to go to sleep to his voice listening to the tapes.
So another thing that brings Vietnamese joy is Vietnamese food. And we've been having this whole conversation in the chat that maybe the authors have not seen, but saying, hey, Vietnamese food is better than French food in all these different kinds of ways. So our last and really difficult question for everybody here, and I'm going to answer it first, and then Philip, you're going to answer it because you've had time to answer it, and then we'll go to our authors. Is if you could be one kind of Vietnamese food, what would you be? So if I were a Vietnamese food, I would be hot vịt lộn, because that is really Vietnamese. Because honestly, like, oh, this is not a food that I have seen that has been like modified by non-Vietnamese people. Okay, like you really have to know what you're doing to have hot vịt lộn. And of course, for those of you out there who have never had hot vịt lộn, it is something that, as far as I know, we only share with Filipinos who have their own version, balut, and it is it's half fertilized duck egg that is boiled, or is it steamed? I can't remember. It's boiled, and then you crack it open, and when you open it up, you see basically, you know, a semi, you know, part of the bird is still in there, and it's delicious. You know, it's delicious. Okay. And I did, and the juice, as Philip says, is really great. And I had a hard time doing that when I was a kid. All kids do, but I really, you know, whenever I go to Vietnam, even during the period of bird flu, when parents said, don't have the hot vịt lộn, I still had the hot vịt lộn on the streets, and it was like 50 cents or less from street vendors. So that is my, if I were a Vietnamese food, that would be me. Philip, if you were a Vietnamese food, what would you be?
I would be a plate of bun bok lọc, wrapped up, warm, cozy, once meant for royals because I'm luxurious, like the heritage, you know, and I'm luxurious like that. And you can't just have one, you got to have like the whole plate, you know. That's what I would say. Bun bok lọc, bun nam or bun la also as a close second. Anything wrapped in a banana leaf. Pass it to you.
Okay, Phong, you're next. Phong.
I have to say tikal. And the reason is that you get the sweet and the salty, you get the pork, you get the eggs, you get, you know, it's a celebratory food. And so all of those things, yeah, feed in.
Awesome. I love that too. Quế Mai, you have the last word here.
I think I would be a green mango to be eaten with salt, pepper, and chili. So I grew up in Bạc Liêu, and my family had a big mango tree, and the mangoes are huge, and they are green, and they're crunchy, they are sweet and sour, delicious.
I agree. Also very Vietnamese. Thank you to our guests, Phong Nguyen and Nguyễn Phan Quế Mai. Thank you to Philip. Thank you to our crew backstage, Frederick, John, and Nicolay, who have helped to make this possible. Thanks to all of you out there in the internet for joining us once again for Accented Dialogues in Diaspora.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. You're amazing. Thank you.